Gentlemen, welcome to the 12th Z Jaipur Literature Festival's Charbagh. We're delighted to introduce session 82, The Biographers Ball, presented by Outlook. We have Audrey Truschke, Charles Spencer, Parvati Sharma, Sir Roy Strong CH, Simon Sebag Montefiore in conversation with Jerry Pinto. Let's welcome the panel on stage with a round of applause.
Hi, I'm really sorry. History should never be late, and this is about biographies. But outside, it's a good day to actually be doing a panel on biographers, since it's it's Republic Day, and history is being made outside somewhere. Thank you all for being here. Yeah, please do. Have someone come up and introduce everybody? No? Okay, I'm sorry. So over there is Charles Spencer, who's written a book about Charles II of Bombay. Are clap properly? Thank you. Audrey Truschke is a remarkably brave lady who has written about Aurangzeb and rewritten many of my notions about Aurangzeb. Simon Sebag Montefiore is addicted to taking selfies. No, he's written interestingly about two sides of the Russian coin. So he's written about Stalin, and he's written about the Romanovs, and he's written actually a biography of a city. In Calcutta, where I heard him speak, he told a really interesting story about how all his friends and all his acquaintances threatened him with immediate excommunication from their ranks if he did not tell the Jerusalem story as they knew it and as they wanted it. This must sound familiar to many biographers and to many writers of history. Parvati Sharma took on Jahangir. And what is lovely about her vision of Jahangir is, for once, someone celebrates middle-aged love. Celebrates the idea that, yeah, come on, give it up, take it away. I was delighted by the book because it's not about like two young, fit people bumping bodies in Mughal India, but it's about two slightly older people relishing each other because they've been through these storms of youth and now, kings, emperors. And Roy Strong, CH, Companion of Honor, has written an immense diary. It is a wonderful diary, and it is of great use to me because I am writing just now the history of India's first, what is arguably India's first commercial art gallery, which was started in Bombay, largely because Hitler marched into Europe and sent some young Jewish collectors and art historians our way to Bombay. And so I'm afraid I was commandeered into this last night, so I only whisked through everybody's book at high speed, but names and events jump out of Roy Strong's narration of a world that comes from the swinging 60s right up to Mrs. Thatcher, who thought painting was something that, effete idiots did. Yeah. So it's a book. I would recommend all their books to you. And me, I am Jerry Pinto. Yeah? Hi, Jaipur. Yeah. That should have been better applause at that one. Okay. Righto. I want to ask everybody a question. The Talmud says, famously, when you do not kill a man, but you erase a universe. When you're choosing to do a biography, what you are actually doing is trying to take a universe, one person's life, and pin it down in words. Some of these biographies take specific moments. For instance, Charles Spencer's biography of Charles II, that's a lot of Charleses around in the same kind of sentence. Yeah. Anyway, so Charles II, the majority of it is this magnificent, almost, I don't know, Bollywood, Hollywood kind of moment of a king running from imminent death. The possibility. I mean, Dad's just had his head knocked off. And now there's Cromwell, who's going to go and knock heads off several statues all over the cathedrals of England. And here's Charles II in danger of his life. So would you like to start, Charles, by telling us what led you to that, Charles?
Yes, well, I really I have written a conventional biography starting with so-and-so was born on such a day and then he died. But I actually slightly bored myself writing that. And I then decided that the only way I could really make a life interesting to me and hopefully the reader was to take the explosive moment in that life and make that the spine of the book. And of course, fill in the blanks either side. But to me, I really enjoy that. I think that it's rather like movies now. You know, there used to be the old biographical picture, you know, where you would sit through somebody's life. But now you tend to go for that explosive moment, which is more a headline grabbing and gets the adrenaline going.
Audrey, I'm going to use first names if people don't mind. There seem to be lots of, Audrey, Professor Truschke.
Audrey is fine.
Audrey is fine, yeah? You were dealing with somebody who is established in the Indian mind as the bad guy, the Mughal bad guy. And yet your book is remarkably, not careful, but it uses the data of history to actually show that he wasn't all that we thought he was. But you must have known somewhere that we are a nation now that is prone to offense, and we are going to change every single established process by which history is written just to suit ourselves. So, Aurangzeb?
So, you know, I mean, I of course, I walked into this with my eyes wide open, right? I know who Aurangzeb is thought to be in the modern Indian imagination, and in fact, that's where I start the book. I start with the mythical Aurangzeb, who's full of hate and that everybody loves to then hate on in return, right? And I begin and open the book with the renaming of Aurangzeb Road in Delhi in 2015. And you know, in that sense, I think it's important to recognize that perhaps for any historical figure, but perhaps especially for Aurangzeb Alamgir, you can't just start at the beginning. You can't just start with he was born in 1618 in Dohad, Gujarat, right? It doesn't work that way. You have to work through the sort of accretions over time and this heavy baggage that weighs down the historical Aurangzeb Alamgir if we are to have any hope at getting back to that history. You know, and I think that the history, it's not lost. Aurangzeb is actually one of, perhaps the single best recorded Indian Mughal emperor. And, you know, there's a lot there. And so I do try to make good use of that in the book. And I think that we can get to the serious work of history, but it takes a little bit of sort of, working through the present to begin.
So, Simon, I'll just jump you because we've got Jahangir on this side. So I thought Mughal to Mughal, you know. Jahangir, on the other hand, has this image of being like a wastrel and, you know, like the fellow who didn't do much except sit around and get drunk or not drunk, opium was his thing. Both. Oh, very good. My kind of guy. Okay. But your remarkable biography, which again, like, unfortunately through. I'm so looking forward to going to all of these books and actually immersing myself in them. Your Jahangir is a very different man.
Well, yes. I mean, in the sense that, you know, I've come to this from the perspective of a fiction writer. Fiction is what I've written before, and as you'll know, Jerry, you know, one of the challenges and excitements of writing fiction is finding a character that you can, you know, play with and work with. And I've so far written fiction of the sort of, you know, this realist mode of everyday people doing everyday things, dealing with urban angst. And from there, I went to Jahangir, who is, you know, nothing could be more different. He's just this grand Mughal emperor. And full of all kinds of contradictions. I mean, And this was one of the joys and delights for me of writing this book, that not only the contradictions of his life, this emperor who was born as a result of these great prayers to God by Akbar and Sheikh Salim Chishti, and he's an answer to prayers, and then he turns out to be actually a big disappointment to his father. But also in the multiplicity of interpretation around him. So there's one interpretation of him as a sort of weak, wastrel, waste of time, basically not worth engaging with. And then, more recent historical perspective, historical theories and analyses of him that re-examine his life, and in fact suggest that some of this is propaganda that has been continuing from the time of Jahangir's son, Shah Jahan, downwards. And this was very exciting for me as a reader, and someone who's sort of dabbling in academics after a very long time, to see how many perspectives you can have on an individual life.
And now to Simon, because from one individual perspectives on a life, here you have the biography of a city. And it is my contention that a city is often mistaken for its built-up spaces. Like Jaipur is supposed to be Hawa Mahal and Amer Fort. But actually a city is really a conurbation of human lives interacting with each other. And those build the stories, and those build the cities and the buildings of our imaginations. So Simon, when you're dealing with something like Jerusalem, which kind of like beggars imagination just to think about writing up the Jerusalem of today, to do a biography of that city from the time, I don't know, Solomon's temple was standing, and someone was putting an eagle inside it, and all the Jews were trying to kill each other. I mean, how did you, what gave you the guts?
Well, I mean, I think the Jerusalem was the most challenging subject I've ever done. And I must say, I didn't really sleep for about 3 years writing it. Partly because everyone had threatened me so viciously not to miss out their tragedy or their triumph. And so I was determined, actually, to get as close as I could to a truth, if a truth existed about Jerusalem. I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. The concept was there were too many books about which pillar was put there by which Byzantine emperor, and not enough about the people. And I wanted to get to a feel of a city where there was music, where people had love affairs, where the steps were smoothed by generations of families walking the streets. And I wanted to get a feeling of those streets. So that was the idea of the biography. And plus, of course, the Bible always talks about Jerusalem as a woman, as a beautiful woman normally in the Jewish scriptures. And I like that idea, so I always think of Jerusalem as a she after that. But it was a terrifying prospect. And the essential thing was to offend everybody equally. And there's the great story of Sir Ronald Stores, who was the first governor of Jerusalem in 1917, the British governor. And when he arrived, everyone quite liked him, the Jews, the Muslims, the Christians. And then after about a year, Stores had offended everybody and was at war with everyone, the Jews, the Arabs, the Christians. So he went to Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister, and he said, Prime Minister, I've got to resign. I've offended everybody. The Jews hate me, the Arabs hate me, the Christians hate me, I've got to resign. And Lloyd George, quick as a flash, said, no, if any of them stop hating you, you'll be fired. So that's the kind of, that was my moving spirit in writing the book.
Maybe that's what historians and biographers also should think. If no one's offended, I've done a bad job. Roy, yours is an amazing document that includes, by the way, an elopement. Okay, so इसमें action है, emotion है, romance है, drama है, tragedy है, art है. But in the writing of, when you finally decided that those diaries were to go public, what was how did you encounter the Roy Strong of 30 years ago, 40 years ago? Was he like another character to you? Or was there like a familiarity?
Well, the decision to publish my diaries, there are 3 volumes, 2 which have appeared, and there's a 3rd to appear next year. They begin really in 1967. And at 31, I was appointed the youngest ever director of the National Portrait Gallery, which is the dowdiest gallery in London. And literally within the year, I turned that round, and people were queuing to come in to the first exhibition ever in a national collection in the UK of photography. And it was Cecil Beaton, and Vogue, the magazine, was behind it. And suddenly, it was the 60s. Everyone was at the opening party, from Noel Coward to Mick Jagger. And then not long after, I was at a dinner party, and a woman turned to me and she said, "You're a very young man to hold such an important position. You should write a diary." So I went home and tried to write a diary, not very well. Then suddenly, I began to be able to do it. And one was literally at this throbbing heart of this explosion in the UK, late 60s into the early 70s, to the collapse of the oil, with the oil crisis. And things would happen like Cecil Beaton would ring up and say, "Oh, the Queen Mother's coming to lunch next week. She always meets the same old dreary people, so I'm asking you." So off we went into a whole different kind of world. The decision to publish in the end, I left a 10-year gap. And it appalls me what is printed these days. People go up so close to today. If you ask me whether it's a daily diary, the answer is not no. It is, I think, there may be reflective pieces, there may be... I'm usually very protective of my close friends, but I have often been part of or witness to, great ceremonial events. I hold an office at Westminster Abbey, for instance, and, I was actually part of the Queen Mother's funeral, and I was part of the ceremonial. Well, that was the funeral. You won't like to be reminded of the last Empress of India, although she wasn't proclaimed as such with all her titles. So I've been in a very fortunate position, but it is quite difficult because when they came out in 1996, my godfathers, they caused a sensation because when I put my pen to paper, somebody wrote, "A reputation fell on the floor with every sentence." I mean, politicians, arts people, and all the rest of it were massacred en route. But I'm also told by the reader of it, who read the draft in her hairdresser's, and she said she practically fell off the chair with laughter because it is so funny. But it's true, as the chair of this meeting says, it is also romantic because it tells the story of me marrying very late a wonderful wife to whom I was devoted for 32 years. But now I'm a widower, and I'm now in my mid-80s, so there's not much diary to go, but boy, I'm doing it still.
Well said, sir. I'm going to take the next round of questions to something I read that Parvati said in an interview, which is, how do you put yourself, I'm quoting you roughly, into the spirit of a man, of an emperor, who lived in the 16th and 17th century? How do you understand what his motivations are? How do you understand what he's thinking or feeling or how he's acting? We judge them, I think, largely by modern middle-class standards. To all of you then, when you're putting yourself back into that time, what is the requirement of historic empathy that you must have to deal with someone who is clearly not like you? So, Parvati, will you go with that first?
Well, I'm not sure. I suppose in one sense it's not possible, is it? I mean, that to think of an emperor from the 16th, 17th century in the terms that we would think of people now. So certainly when I was writing this book, I didn't even try to, because it would have just muddled things up, in my head and in the writing. What I felt in the course of writing it was that I was entering a world that was half familiar and half sort of almost hallucinatory. It had this hallucinatory quality of being sort of familiar but also very, very strange. And there were so on the one hand, let me say, there are certain things perhaps that one could empathize with. Let's say the fact of Jahangir turning out to be a bit of a disappointment to his father. One can imagine that somebody like Akbar, who was just the greatest Mughal emperor and one of the greatest emperors of the world that has ever known. No son could possibly match up to that kind of father. And that experience of not meeting our parents' standards is something that all of us are familiar with. So it's not, so you can sort of think it through. Yes, especially us. And, but on the other hand, there are things about him, like the sheer wealth and power of this man is something that I think none of us could possibly imagine now. And it comes through in little details. There's this one incident where he goes fishing with this particular kind of net, and then he masters the use of that net, and he manages to catch a dozen fish, and then Jahangir lets them go, but in imperial splendor, he pins a pearl in each of their noses, and that, that is wealth, that is power, when even, you're distributing your pearl to fish. So that is just, I think, to be enjoyed, yeah.
I think what I got was what we can associate with today, what we can resonate with today, certainly is the casual cruelty of rulers,
yes,
which still seems to be a kind of trope that is running through our world. Audrey, with you, again, there's Aurangzeb. There is this sea of hostility, and Parvati's got a subcontinental connection. You're dealing with a Mughal from, across the waters. Was there much effort required for that historical empathy?
So I would say yes, absolutely. Mughal India was a very different place than modern India, right? The past is a very foreign world. And, in terms of, what did it take for me to get to that? So it took a lot of effort, right? I have spent years studying relevant languages. I read both Sanskrit and Persian. That is no mean feat. In terms of empathy, right, that's a sort of striking word for many people to think about in relationship to the most hated man, arguably in Indian history. But I do strive to include empathy as part of historical method. This is part of the mission of historians. Empathizing with a 17th century king does not mean that you have to like him. It doesn't mean you excuse what he did. It doesn't mean that you justify what he did. But it does mean that you humanize him and you understand him as a man on his own terms and as a man of his own times rather than as a cartoon villain. And that idea that we should understand him as a man of his own times, this does not exist in a bubble. The point of doing that is so that we can explain him and who he was, how he acted as emperor of Hindustan and of the Mughal Empire. In terms of, practically speaking, a lot of my work is textual. Almost all of my work actually is textual. So what I do is I sit there and I read text, published text in manuscript format, mainly in Persian for Aurangzeb Alamgir, also a little bit in Sanskrit, a little bit in Braj Bhasha, pre-modern Hindi. And you want to read sources as widely as possible, right? I use court histories, but I also use histories written by Kayists, right? People like Bhimsen Kayist, who served Aurangzeb on and off in the Deccan Wars. I read Sanskrit intellectuals who tried, generally unsuccessfully, to gain Aurangzeb's patronage, right? So you want to sort of get as many perspectives as possible, and then put it all together in pursuit of understanding Aurangzeb as a king. And that is something that I do want to underscore. I think often today, people want to know, what did Aurangzeb really think, right? Was he really a pious Muslim? Was he really filled with hatred? And the short answer to those questions is I have absolutely no idea. The slightly longer answer is I really don't care. I don't care what a guy in the 17th century thought, and even if I did, I can't get in behind the skull of a dead guy, right? Who's been dead for more than 300 years now. What I can do is I can tell you how he acted, right? How he affected change within his empire and beyond it. And that's why we should care about Aurangzeb Alamgir as a historical figure, because of his impact on the Indian subcontinent and ultimately far beyond.
I'm taking this to Simon right now because in the history of hated people, there is Hitler, who gets a great deal of the attention, but there's Stalin, and Stalin, for some reason, did serious and savage damage to people. He killed millions of people, literally. Do you think as many were in the same range? and he seems to have got away with a lot less flack. So what was it like empathizing in historical empathy with Stalin?
Well, I think people have a much better idea now what Stalin did than they did. Obviously, you know, I mean, obviously there were many apologists, as you know, in the British establishment, in British academe. A lot of what Audrey's just said about Aurangzeb applies to Stalin in the sense that, you know, there's no point in writing a sort of preachy biography about one of these statesmen who dealt in giant political questions. I mean, the one thing that you could say about Stalin, which was clear from the beginning, was that he was obsessed with politics. Everything was about politics for him. It's a slightly different skill from inheriting a throne, even if you have to fight for it against your brothers and parents and whatever. It's a very different thing being born a cobbler in a small hovel in Gori in Georgia, a distant province of the Russian Empire, which did not speak the same language even as the Russian rulers, and to end up as ruler of that empire is quite the most one of the most extraordinary feats of modern times. And you know, one of the things I was searching for all the time was just a clue to how that happened. And much of it, of course, is luck and chance. Much of it is personality. As to how to penetrate that world, I totally agree with Audrey. You just have to read everything you can about these people. When I'm writing one of these books, whether it's the Romanos or Jerusalem, I immerse myself in the fiction, in the poetry, in the music, in everything. One of the things that's different with our eras, I think, and our world, is that there's a huge amount of private correspondence that exists from Stalin, which no one had really read. And I was really lucky. After I did my Catherine the Great biography, for some reason, the new president of Russia at that time, he was called Putin, he took a liking to me weirdly.
No.
And I mean, I haven't met him.
That's dangerous.
But he read. The one thing about Putin that's interesting is that, unlike Stalin, who was a complete bibliophile and a man of letters, whatever you think of his own achievements, he was obsessed with books. His apartments were always filled with documents, and all his library has marginalia on every book. So he read everything all night. But he also left this vast correspondence. But I was saying about Putin. So Putin was surprised that I'd been kind of complimentary about Catherine and Potemkin, and so he said, and he'd read the books for some reason. He loves reading the books of political histories, and so he said, this guy can have a first go at Stalin's papers. And so that was a very exciting moment, clearly. And those papers really allowed me to, you could never get inside the brain of anybody, as you said, but to get a feel for him. When you read thousands and thousands of notes by someone, you begin to get a feel for them, and that's the best you can hope for.
Sorry, quick question before we go to Charles. Is it true that Catherine the Great died the way we all think she died?
No.
Okay.
No. I'm very shocked by that question.
I'm a schoolboy. I read it somewhere and I thought, really? My God. There are two portraits in your book. One portrait is when Charles is in exile and in exile, fearing for his life, he's standing, he's posing for a portrait. And there's another one of him, rather louche and kind of, he's now in, were there other resources like those that helped you decide what your image of him was going to be?
Well, it's very interesting you picked up on that, because what I was trying to do with my biography of Charles II, for the English people in the audience, if they think of Charles II, it's not a very serious man they've got in their mind. It is the louche one you're talking about. It's the one who, I've totted up 52 known mistresses, many illegitimate children, he even took some of his equivalent of cabinet meetings in the bedroom. So he's a man who enjoyed life quite a lot. And that was what I was wrestling with, because the story I was focusing on, as I mentioned, the backbone of this story, is a completely surprising one. It's of a man of action who was really alive to the danger that he was facing, who was resourceful, who was charming, who was cunning, and who actually survived an escape attempt that was almost impossible to pull off. And yes, he was lucky, but also he just judged things right. He shed people who were on the run with him because he knew if he had a chance, he had to pretty much go it alone. So the portrait of him in armor, if I'm doing a PowerPoint presentation, I say, well, this is the man we're dealing with. And then I found these letters from people who had been on campaign with him, who celebrated, as a young man, his great personal bravery. So I think part of the biographers, while you've been talking, it's so interesting because you really think as one of the panel here about what this is all about. So for me, a biographer, of course, has to reveal things of interest and novelty about their subject because you can't just reassure people about their prejudice about the person. And another great duty is to put them in, obviously, a historical context. Every time you read a review of a successful biography, somebody's pulled off that, which is illuminating the age. But I want to touch back on something which I think is equally important, which Simon touched on when he was talking about Jerusalem. For me, it's about reconnecting with human beings, even if it is 400 years ago, who are very, very similar to us. We really haven't progressed that much at all. And one of the appeals of history to me has always been people watching. And it is the triumphs and the disasters and the loves and the tragedies, the ghastliness of life and the moments of joy that we can connect with. It doesn't matter how far back they are a common human experience. So I think you're really cooking in a big pot and you've got to throw lots of different things in if you're going to pull off a good biography.
I wanted to ask you, Roy, the idea of when you're doing a diary would be to constantly be aware of who you are. I mean, are you thinking right now how you would turn this interview in this moment into a diary entry? Are you constantly aware of, I should put that down in my diary, that remark?
Certainly not, but I will, probably at the end of this festival, write a diary entry. But I'd like to throw up something else at you. It is actually quite a restricted range of people we want to hear about. Charles II, there's a market. Elizabeth I of England, a market. Mary Queen of Scots, Dickens, the Bloomsbury Circle, it's a kind of industry. I used to write about the Elizabethan period. There must be 50 biographies of her. The other thing we haven't touched on is that every generation has to rewrite those biographies. So, in fact, Elizabeth I starts in the Victorian period. Oh, they don't like her. She wasn't a lady. She swore. She really, and she flirted with men. Oh, she didn't go down at all. Mary, Queen of Scots. Oh, she was a lady and she was badly done by. She was a good girl, but they did her wrong. So you've got the whole scenario there, and it's a story gets written again and again and again, and then you get it picked up in the movies. Betty Davis is Elizabeth I. Now there's a new Mary, Queen of Scots. So that all those two aspects, I think, are very important. What did you ask me?
I'm asking you whether in the process of being this magnificent diarist...
I shall do vivid word characters of everybody sitting on this platform. And none of you will live long enough to read it.
Which is the wonderful thing about dealing with a dead person. They're fair game. It's like out there, but he's dealing with himself, who's a living person, but he's dealing with himself. So that's all right. Would any of you consider doing, a biography of someone who's alive, who's around?
Well, I mean, you wouldn't write Putin's biography if you wanted to stay alive. For a start. And secondly, but I was very lucky doing Stalin because unlike all of us except Roy, actually, I was writing about someone who'd lived quite recently, really in the lifetimes of my parents. So when I went to do it, I didn't just have to depend on written works, as you both did, for example, but I was able to go and interview, and I went and found all the families and the children of all the leadership, including people like Beria and Molotov and Malenkov and Mikoyan and all these people. I found their families, and some of the families were sort of charming and aristocratic. Some of them were still kind of vicious Stalinists who kind of were terrifying. I mean, one of them said to me, like, you're a CIA agent, and you and the CIA have poisoned the world with AIDS. In the middle of my interview, and I was horrified by that experience. but other.
I knew it.
Yeah, but it's very difficult to deny that you're a CIA agent. When you're interviewing a 94-year-old woman who's pointing at you and she just said CIA, CIA. I was like, stop that. So that was interesting. But other people were wonderful. And I remember, I was interviewing the Mikoyan family. Mikoyan he actually visited India, I think, and he was one of Stalin's top henchmen. And he is always people were much more sympathetic to Mikoyan. Everyone thought he was a decent person, the only decent person in the Politburo. And while I was there, they found the piece of paper, the document, which had ordered the massacre of the Katyn Woods, when they killed 28,000 Polish officers for no reason whatsoever. They just executed them all and buried them in the woods of Katyn. And it showed that Mikoyan had signed this. And so I had the job of going to the Mikoyan's children and telling them that I said to them, I've got slightly bad news about you. Your father was a wonderful man, but he did sign at least this decree ordering the massacre of 28,000 completely innocent people. And his son looked at me for a long time and he said, not a good day for the Mikoyan family. And that's all he said.
Most of you seem to deal with the constrictions of fact as an everyday experience. When you're writing within a factual tradition. You need to have your... but Parvati, you've been a novelist before that, and now you've worked with the factual record. Are you looking forward to going back to inventing it all? Or will you do some more biographies?
I am looking forward to doing both, actually, but I think this particular experience has given me a whole new perspective on writing fiction. Because, I think with fiction and with characters, there's a tendency to because it is an artificial world and an artificial character, artificial story that we are creating, there's a tendency to try and make it whole, that it should go from point A to point B, and all of it should be coherent and it should make sense. And one of the most freeing and perhaps exhilarating aspects of working on this biography of Jahangir was that it didn't all have to fit. It didn't all have to make sense. You could have this man who has this greatly aesthetic intelligence and sensibility. He can go into ecstasies over flowers, and at the same time, if one of his noblemen rebels against him, he has him stripped naked and stuffed inside a dead ox and paraded across the streets of Lahore until he suffocates and dies. And there was no imperative, I felt no need to reconcile these two and make one thing out of him. He could be both these things. And I would, I think, want to take that back to my fiction writing. Yeah.
Good luck. Yeah, with fiction, you've got to get it right. I mean, they look all charming and polite, but these are readers. And they're very severe with fiction writers and with non-fiction writers. I know you're waiting to ask questions, but please, we love you very much, but short questions and pointed ones. Try not to give us your potted biography. They won't write you. Yeah? Anybody put up your paws? There's one at the back there. First that gentleman with the mustard. Yeah, give it to him.
Hi. Well, you already cautioned us about keeping it short. I'd first like to compliment Audrey for the feistiness with which she takes on Hindutva trolls on the internet. My point being, while it is very easy to sort of jump to conclusions about people with one-line opinions on historical characters and think maybe this guy hasn't read enough, you've all advised that you should read as many sources about each figure and then form an opinion. My point was that even when you do that, so somebody like Jadunath Sarkar, like a serious historian, very, very well researched, but still you could not stop him from being extremely anti-Aurangzeb. So my question is, would you agree that a biography is actually as much about the biographer as it is about the subject?
Excellent question. I think all of you should answer it. But start off with Audrey.
Right. So I would not agree with that statement. What I would agree with is that everybody is subjective and everybody writes from a certain point of view. That said, objectivity remains a useful sort of ideal for me to strive towards. The fact that I can never be fully objective, as no person on the face of this earth has been, or ever will be fully objective, does not mean it's not worth striving for, right? So I think that there's a tendency right now to, in the era of sort of, fake news and just making stuff up, people just want to throw up their hands and say, oh, well, everybody has a point of view, right? Even Jodhpur Sarkar had a point of view, right? So what is the point? And I think that that is a grave mistake. I think that there are degrees of subjectivity and there are degrees of moving towards objectivity. I do think that my work and the work of any scholar or any writer, for that matter, should be read in its relevant context. In my case, I forefront that for you in my Aurangzeb book, right, with sort of nationalist politics in India. That's the context in which I'm writing. And, if, God forbid, anyone's still reading my book in 50 years, they should understand that I'm writing, in the sort of Modi Sarkar, so on and so forth. But that said, I do think that objectivity is a useful ideal, and I invite my readers to judge my arguments, and I hope that at least some of them are an improvement on Jodhpur Sarkar's, which is not a sort of a knock against him so much as it is an endorsement of the two of us, separated by several decades, being involved in the same sort of process, which is trying to better understand the Mughal past.
Excellent. Charles.
Well, I try to be even-handed with a subject and with the period, but I think you don't want to suck the lifeblood out of the story by being too anodyne. And so do I put myself in it? I do, but I don't, I've never sort of fallen in love with one of the people I've written about. So you try and keep that objectivity. And my last 3 books have been about the English Civil War in the mid-17th century. And what's been very exciting to me is I've had reviews saying I'm too much on the King's side and on Parliament's side. So that makes me feel quite happy. But I think you have to be responsible. You want to give the readers something exciting to read and something that's going to stir their brain, but at the same time not load your prejudices into the picture.
Thank you. Simon?
Well, I think you've both put very well what I would say. I think another problem is the subject penetrating the writer's mind. I remember writing Stalin. First of all, every writer has to put themselves into situations and wonder how they would react to those situations. That's part of the writer's job, even being objective. But also, when I was writing my Stalin book, I was so immersed in it that I actually had nightmares imagining my own execution. And so that maybe is taking the art of biography too far.
No, so many of the stories he was telling in Calcutta ended with she was taken into a room and shot in the back of her head or something like that. I can quite imagine that. Parvati, quickly.
I would say...
You or Jahangir?
Certainly Jahangir. I think I too would agree with what Audrey says. She put it very well. Certainly I wouldn't want to put myself into the book, then the book would not be, it would fail. And I think that would work also in fiction, actually. If you become too close to your subject or become unable to have perspective on your subject, then it doesn't work. On the other hand, of course, you are, perhaps I could say that, at least in my experience in this one biographies, of perhaps explaining a friend to someone, a friend whom you are fond of, but also know that I can understand their flaws, and so you have a sort of sympathetic explanation of somebody, but not an explanation which you are party with that person.
And you, Roy, have a really, really interesting conundrum to face. Roy on Roy.
I have written biography. And the one thing you can be sure with any biography, you really have to have something of a love affair with the main character, even though you may condemn them. And the other thing you have to be certain of, that your work will be replaced by the next generation. Do remember, it is a perpetual rewrite of these characters that makes them so fascinating, and they really often reflect more the preoccupations of the era that we're living in than the actual era in which the person lived. Also, add to that the fact that sources for the last 50 to 100 years are still not open, still being discovered. And how will anybody deal with email, Twitter, Facebook, and the whole social thing? The morass of sources for future biographers Well, I won't be here, but good luck to them. Boy, oh, good luck.
Yeah, and then, you consider the manicuring that goes into those personalized narratives in which you have become the star of your own story. You know how many things you've trimmed and edited and manipulated to look like you're leading this golden life. Really, biographers are going to have something to deal with. There's a young lady over there with her hand up. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the enlightening talk. My question is to you, Simon. I've read all your books, and Romanov's was particularly interesting. So as a non-historian, and this question is more as a reader, how do you keep the distinction alive between the fiction, the historical fiction and the history, so that it's interesting and it's a page-turner?
It's a very good question. I mean, I also write fiction, and I see them as hugely different. I mean, the key thing is I have a rule, we've talked about objectivity, but never to invent, never to imagine anything that isn't in a source of some sort, and it has to be a source that you regard as true. And I might say, all those people I interviewed, for example, I mean, I had to double check everything they said. Personal witnesses always lie prodigiously about everything. I mean, all of the people I claim to have met Stalin the whole time. All of them claim to have been at dinners repeatedly with him. After I'd interviewed about 20 of them, I discovered they were all at one dinner once with Stalin, and they'd never met him again. But all of them had claimed it happened every week. So one has to be pretty careful with the sources. And I think history is history, and fiction is drama, is novels, is movies, and you go to the history with proper notes and proper archives for the history.
You will notice how cleverly I have been inserting myself into the narrative as well. When I heard Simon in Calcutta, like, we are old friends. This is what we do all the time. It's very funny. Yeah, there's a gentleman at the back. Yeah, why is it that when there's 6 minutes left, every hand goes up? Come on. Yeah.
Hi, my question is for Miss Trusch. I've read your book, Aurangzeb, and being one of the most controversial figures in history, how did you manage to provide such a wholesome perspective on such a man?
How did you manage to survive all the heckling and the...
Oh, right. So, it is not pleasant to be the target of hate and of heckling. Nobody likes this, and... Sorry? Okay, sorry. It is not pleasant to be the target of hate and dislike. Nobody likes getting death threats, rape threats, so on and so forth. How do I deal with it? Practically speaking, I have a very thick skin that has served me rather well. I ignore it to a large degree. I analyze it. That's something that helps academics in general, right? I put it in a context. I sort of, separate myself from it by taking an analytical stance. I block pretty aggressively on Twitter, especially. I check out of social media. Wine is not a bad option in the evenings. But I will say that I think that there is a pretty serious cost to all of this hate being lobbed against me. And it's not the price that I am paying, which, is some mental anguish and so on and so forth. The real price is that it is driving other academics away from Indian history and especially from public engagement with Indian history. Most of my time is spent in academic circles, and so when I meet my colleagues, particularly in the West, but also in India to some degree, generally people will come up to me at an academic event, and usually the first thing out of their mouth is something like, "Audrey, really proud of you. You've been doing great. Like, glad you wrote Aurangzeb." Usually the second thing out of their mouth is, "There's no way I would do what you're doing, right? There is no way I want to go through that." So I think that you're seeing academics choose different topics. And just not focusing on certain parts of Indian history. And I think that you're seeing a lot of academics just opt out of public engagement, whether that means just not writing books meant for a popular readership. Some academics are just declining to publish their books in India altogether and only publishing them in the West. And this is a big problem because it means that the largest audience for Indian history, right, the people here in India who care about it and think of it as their own heritage because it is your history, that you're not getting access to some of the most cutting-edge research because people are afraid, for very good reasons, to speak about it. And I think that that's something that we should take very seriously going forward.
Thank you so much, Audrey. I think if we can all make up our minds right now that India is a kind country. We are a kind country. We don't have to be like this. We just have to say, well, you know, she wrote this and I didn't like it, and I'm going to write a critical response, a thought-out response, engage with other minds rather than as fists or as you know, guns or penises. We're actually going to all benefit from that. We're right out of time now, but remember one thing, they're generally floating about. Go up to them, engage with them, buy their books, get them to sign them, don't bring pieces of paper up. They're sweet people, but pieces of paper. Books are full of pieces of paper. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience, and I'm sure they'll all agree.
We wish to thank Audrey Truschke, Charles Spencer, Parvati Sharma, Sir Roy Strong CH, Simon Sebag Montefiore, and Jerry Pinto, as well as Outlook for the